Welcome back, friends and family. Just Christina here. This is part 5 of The Insiders, Architects of the New World Order. This is the George W. Bush years, and we'll begin at 2003. For more than a generation, presidential elections in the United States have been deceptively presented to the voting public as genuine contests between two major candidates. Repeatedly, Americans have been assured that they had a real choice when they marked their ballots for either a Democrat or a Republican. Other than style, however, there's little to differentiate the two parties. One pledges swift enactment of an agenda, while the other promises to proceed more cautiously towards the same goals. Rhetoric aside, each has labored for many years to bring our nation into a new world order. The long-standing goal of the insiders calls for building an all-powerful United Nations with total authority over a weakened United States, and for fastening big government socialistic programs on the American people. Acknowledgement of this goal and the phoniness of the supposed political struggle occasionally emerges from the shadows, as it did in 1966 with the publication of Georgetown University professor Carroll Quigley's revelations about an elitist secret society determined to rule the world. In his Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, Quigley even named the Council on Foreign Relations as the visible U.S. branch of what he termed this network, whose participants we have labeled the insiders. Now, of course, our current president deems this the swamp. It's one and the same. Of special interest, Quigley neatly summed up a well-hidden truth about American politics. With a burst of candor rarely seen in our politically correct world, he wrote, "The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps the right and the other the left, is a foolish idea acceptable only to the doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw out the rascals at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy." Along with this passage from the 1,348-page tome, the man acknowledged by Bill Clinton as his mentor pointed to policies that are vital and necessary for America that are no longer subjects of significant disagreement, but are disputable only in details of procedure, priority, or method. "These shared policies," wrote Quigley, "provide assurance that the United States will continue to function as a great world power in cooperation with other powers, avoid high-level war, keep the economy moving without significant slump, help other countries do the same, provide the basic social necessities for all our citizens." From those generalities, it takes little imagination to realize that Quigley expected both parties to 1. Keep our nation in the UN's grasps, 2. Involve the U.S. only in undeclared wars, 3. Continue government management of the nation's economic life, 4. Preserve programs supplying foreign aid for other countries, and 5. Sanction socialistic paternalism for all American people. According to the professor, these goals were no longer subjects of significant disagreement. Unfortunately for our nation, he was correct, and he issued his assessment in 1966. There can be disagreement, he admitted, but only in details of procedure, priority, or method. Quigley and the insiders whose work he described may indeed applaud all of this, but it can only lead to the termination of independence for our nation and the cancellation of freedom for the American people. America is under siege, and the attack comes from within. Unless our counterattack is successfully undertaken, a certain slide into tyranny stares America in the face. Insiders select their candidates. The presidency of George W. Bush will undoubtedly be remembered for his response to the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, and the 2003 war against Iraq. But to understand his legacy, we need to examine the steps leading to his selection as the Republicans' candidate. The actual process, only marginally different from the selection of Al Gore by the Democrats, amounted to a classic insider-orchestrated operation. If the picture painted by Carroll Quigley is accurate, as we believe it is, both the Republicans and Democratic parties should have presented candidates who could be counted on to adhere religiously to the insiders' agenda. Finding such men doesn't happen overnight, but they are found. The insider's method for choosing a reliable standard bearer undoubtedly begins with screening potential nominees for their ability and willingness to follow the insider agenda. A favored few will then find themselves surrounded by insiders, while the mass media, dominated by other insiders, informs the nation that slates of advisors have been named to counsel some frontrunners for the nomination. What most likely occurs is that the hand-picked early favorites are told who their advisors will be. Whoever triumphs on election day will then dutifully place these very handlers in key administrative positions. As we shall show, this is precisely what George W. Bush did after finally being declared the victor in the historically close 2000 contest. Had Al Gore won, he would have undoubtedly filled his administration with the insiders who had surrounded him. In April 1998, fully 2.5 years before the November 2000 election, former Secretary of State George P. Shultz hosted the first meeting of what became a brain trust formed to instruct George W. Bush. Others who aided in tutoring the man that they were training to be the next occupant of the White House included Richard Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Richard Pearl, Robert Zoellick, and Paul Wolfowitz. All but Shultz hold membership in the CFR and become key members of the Bush administration. Shultz, a CFR member from 1974 to 1982, stayed behind as a fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Shultz's leadership in this group is significant. A top insider for decades, as we noted, he held CFR membership from 74 to 82 and served on its board of directors from 80 to 82. Acceptable to either Republican or Democratic administrations, he held posts in the Eisenhower, which was Republican, Kennedy, Democrat, Nixon, Republican, and Reagan, Republican, all those four administrations, and each of them was dominated by CFR members. Beginning in 1974, Shultz spent 8 years as a top executive with San Francisco insider-connected Bechtel Corporation, and in 1982, he returned to government as President Reagan's Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, Shultz compiled an uninterrupted record of promoting internationalism and appeasing communism. After the Brain Trust's initial gathering at the Shultz residence, additional sessions with Governor Bush were held in Austin, Texas, and then via teleconferencing, fax, and electronic messaging. Mr. Bush obviously earned good grades in the Insider postgraduate course as he became the overwhelming favorite for the 2000 Republican presidential nomination. During the year leading up to the 2000 election, evidence that the insiders had solidified their grip on both eventual major party nominees surfaced when each publicly named his slate of foreign policy advisors. Of the 15 tapped by Republican Bush in December 1999, the names of all but one could be found on the current or recent rosters of the Council of Foreign Relations. The CFR member Bush advisors named by the New York Times and other media organs were George Shultz, Richard Cheney, Robert Zoellick, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Condoleezza Rice, Henry Kissinger, Newt Gingrich, Donald Rumsfeld, Martin Feldstein, Robert Blackwell, Stephen Hadley, Robert Kimmitt, and Dov Zakim. Because he had proven himself as an insider favorite for decades, Democrat Al Gore needed less training, but he followed the insider established pattern by naming 11 CFR members to his own foreign policy team in May of 2000. These were Joseph Lieberman, Richard Holbrooke, Richard Gardner, Mel Levine, Joan Spiro, Robert Hunter, Laura Tyson, Ashton Carter, Graham Allison, Mark Ginsburg, and Samuel Berger. Though neither Bush nor Gore were himself a CFR member, each eventually selected a running mate who possessed the insider credential. Richard Cheney filled out the Republican ticket, and Senator Joe Lieberman, a Democrat from Connecticut, won the equivalent post to the Democratic slate. Insiders were thus assured that there would be no departure from their behind-the-scenes agenda, no matter who triumphed on Election Day. In the CFR's Foreign Affairs for September-October of 2000, CFR member James M. Lindsay reported, "Both Al Gore and George Bush are internationalists by inclination. As described by Quigley, voters could choose either insider candidate A or candidate B. Outsider candidates were either effectively ignored or routinely trashed by the CFR-controlled media." When George W. Bush won the presidency after the closest election in memory, he gave the members of the Insider Brain Trust the very topmost posts in his government. Bush toes the insider line. George W. Bush's only personal insider credential, his membership in Yale University's secretive Skull and Bone Society, likely came his way because his father possessed the same dubious connection. The future 43rd president graduated from Yale in 1968, spent several years in the Texas Air National Guard, earned an MBA at Harvard University, and returned to Texas in 1975 to begin a career in the volatile oil business. His attempt to win a U.S. House seat in 1978 saw him squeak out a victory in a Republican primary, but earn a Texas-sized trouncing at the hands of a Democrat in the general election. In any of his pursuits, the Bush name has been his most valuable asset. It certainly rose to importance when his father became vice president and then president. Being the son of such a prominent insider, it really helped George secure several corporate positions, one of which led him to the ownership of the Texas Rangers baseball club. He won election as governor of Texas in 1994. Early in 1998, the Texas Republican Convention produced a decidedly anti-insider platform. It called for abolishing the EPA, ATF, and 3 federal departments: Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, and Education. Supported overwhelmingly by the 7,500 convention delegates, this official party statement also recommended a gold standard and a place for the Federal Reserve, withdrawal of the U.S. from the United Nations, repeal of NAFTA and GATT trade agreements, and termination of the U.S. contributions to the International Monetary Fund. It even urged Congress to conduct a thorough investigation of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. As the Republican governor running for re-election, Bush was aghast. Already being schooled by the Brain Trust, he promptly announced that he wouldn't endorse the platform, claiming that it was only a statement of the delegates of the convention, not the position of any candidate for office. The Houston Chronicle said that Bush runs on his own agenda, and that agenda included little of what the Texas Republicans wanted. Had he supported any one of those demands, he would have lost favor with his new mentors. His refusal to back the Texas Republican platform failed to cost him, however. When he won re-election as governor in 1998, the attention he received from insiders escalated. Richard Cheney, an insider's insider. When George Shultz led in the early selection and training of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney soon filled the role of primary mentor. A feature article in the July 28, 2002 issue of USA Today claimed that Cheney is clearly the dominant voice in shaping foreign policy. It stated further that he and his aides have shaped the administration's strategy in the war on terrorism and U.S. positions in Iraq. A January 31, 2003 article in the New York Times described the powerful bond between Cheney and the president. Mr. Cheney's influence has expanded, stated its authors, who quoted Congressman Rob Portman of Ohio. You feel when you've talked to the vice president that you've talked to the president. Cheney confirmed his complete commitment to the insider agenda and his cunning disdain for the voting public during a speech to the CFR at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Washington, D.C. on February 15, 2002. It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations, he told the assembled insiders. I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. He then added, I never mentioned that when I was campaigning back home in Wyoming. In other words, Cheney deceived Wyoming's voters who never knew his real objectives while he represented them in Congress. His highly revealing and self-indicting remarks drew a round of approving laughter from the insider heavyweights. One heavyweight, shown during the televised event, was a top insider, David Rockefeller. Dick Cheney's long career as an insider actually began when Donald Rumsfeld, at the time a CFR member, chose him for several posts in Richard Nixon's second administration from 1973 to 1974. Cheney then became Deputy Chief of Staff to Rumsfeld during President Ford's presidency. When Rumsfeld accepted appointment as Secretary of Defense, the 34-year-old Cheney took over as Gerald Ford's Chief of Staff. After the Ford defeat in 1976, Cheney returned to his native Wyoming and won election as the state's only member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He served 5 two-year terms from 79 to 89 and postured quite effectively as a committed conservative all those years. Unbeknownst to most of Wyoming's hardy folk, he linked arms with the insiders in 1982 by accepting CFR membership, and later served 2 periods as a member of its board of directors from 87 to 89 and 93 to 95. His congressional career ended when George Bush the Elder named him Secretary of Defense in 1989, a post he filled until 1993 when he left government and accepted a position at Washington's American Enterprise Institute. In 1995, Cheney became CEO of Halliburton Company, a Texas-based supplier for the energy industry. Writing for the New Republic in 2000, Lawrence F. Kaplan quoted an unidentified Halliburton executive who said, "Dick gives us all a level of access that I doubt anyone else in the oil sector can duplicate." Cheney used his connections to lobby successfully for a taxpayer-supplied $490 million export-import bank loan guarantee for Russia's Tyumen Oil Company. Tyumen immediately purchased $300 million worth of equipment from Halliburton. Kaplan even noted that Cheney's remarkably powerful influence weighed more heavily than that of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Texas Governor George W. Bush, both of whom surprisingly sought to block this loan. One can only imagine the national uproar had anyone other than a well-connected insider arranged such a deal. After Desert Storm, our first war with Iraq, Cheney, as George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, directed underling Paul Wolfowitz to suggest future policy. Wolfowitz drew up a plan to rid Iraq of Saddam Hussein. Though Cheney and Wolfowitz lost their posts when the Clinton administration rose to power in 1993, they never lost sight of their goals. By 1997, they formed the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, and sent a letter to President Clinton urging military action to rid Iraq of Hussein. Members of PNAC included Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, Lewis Libby, which was Cheney's former top aide. These men, all possessing CFR credentials, became top officials of the George W. Bush administration and the architects of the 2003 war against Iraq. As the need for a running mate loomed months before the 2000 convention, George W. Bush turned to Dick Cheney to head up a search committee. Cheney, an original member of the Bush Brain Trust, claims to have examined the field intensely and then recommended himself. Bush dutifully approved the selection. The Republican convention then formally nominated the two. Once the Bush-Cheney team had been declared the victor of the 2000 contest, the two loaded their administration with CFR stalwarts, including the veterans of the Bush Brain Trust. Condoleezza Rice became National Security Advisor, Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Robert Zoellick, U.S. Trade Representative, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, Paul Dobriansky, Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, George Tenet, CIA Director, which was a continuation, Elaine Chao, Secretary of Labor, and hundreds more from the New York-based citadel of inside power. In late 2002, near the midpoint of his term, when the nation's economic woes were worsening, Mr. Bush fired Secretary of the Treasury Paul O'Neill, a Cheney colleague from the Ford administration. He immediately filled the post with John W. Snow, who, as chance would have it, is another Cheney pal from the Ford administration days. Snow's appointment earned predictable plaudits from CFR Chairman Peter G. Peterson, who had come to know the newest Treasury Secretary through Snow's membership in Peterson's 10-year-old Concord Coalition. Early insider planning. Insider plotting to bring America into a sovereignty-destroying world government didn't begin with any of the administrations featured in this book. During the Wilson administration from 1913 to 1921, an earlier generation of insiders sought to accomplish their goal by submerging the U.S. in the League of Nations. Champions of the 1919 attempt to subject America to the League included the very individuals who created the Council on Foreign Relations: Edward Mandell House, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Sumner Welles, and Walter Lippmann. Launched in 1921, the CFR didn't hesitate to bear its overall goal when it published Philip Kerr's call for world government in the very first September 1922 issue of Foreign Affairs, the organization's flagship journal. Fueled with funds supplied by the insiders at the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, the CFR's influence grew and its members moved into government during the Franklin Roosevelt administration from 1933 to 1945. During the past half of the century, whether the White House occupant has been a Democrat or a Republican, the CFR-led attack on U.S. sovereignty continued. In every administration, hundreds of top government officials have been actual members of the CFR, or at least its willing accomplices. In 1961, the State Department, led by Dean Rusk of the CFR, created Freedom from War, the United States program for general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world. And President John Kennedy formally presented it to the UN on September 25, 1961. Considered immediately as the fixed and determined policy of the United States government, its successive steps, many of which have already been implemented, culminate in the transfer of the armed forces of all nations, ours certainly included, to the United Nations. The UN would then possess the world's only military force. Why would they need a military force if there was no other? That same year, the State Department hired Professor Lincoln P. Bloomfield of the CFR to create a companion plan, which was published in 1962 as A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. In addition to calling for disarmament of citizens, it likewise stressed the need for nations to cede control of their military forces to the world body. The Bloomfield document bluntly states, the overwhelming central fact would still be the loss of control of their military power by individual nations. If this becomes achievable, the details will not be insurmountable. The UN authorizes, America fights. Steps toward reaching the incredible goal contained in these plans continues to unfold. In part, they spring from the destructive precedent set during the Korean War, when America's forces were sent into battle under UN authorization without the constitutionally required congressional declaration of war. American troops later fought in Vietnam, again with no congressional declaration. Instead, authorization for Vietnam action came into the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, a UN subsidiary formed under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Both of these UN-authorized wars cost heavily in American lives and sovereignty. Like SEATO, NATO sprang from Article 51 of the UN Charter. At its birth in 1949, the American people were told that the alliance had been created to block possible Soviet expansion into Western Europe. But NATO was actually conceived for another purpose. NATO's most important champion, Secretary of State Dean Acheson of the CFR, explained during a March 19, 1949 speech urging the Senate to ratify the pact. It is designed to fit precisely into the framework of the United Nations. It is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. Article 1 of the NATO Charter states that member nations must refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. In its 14 brief articles, the NATO Charter mentions the United Nations 5 times. Americans have been told that NATO not only stemmed the Soviet Union's appetite for further conquest, but that it also brought about the USSR's disintegration. If that were so, and those were NATO's only goals, then one might reasonably expect that the breakup of the USSR in the early 90s would be followed by a breakup of NATO. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, formed in 1954 under the same UN authority. It went out of business in 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War. But NATO not only didn't go out of business, it began to assume political and economic domination over each member state, just as its founders had planned. It has more recently welcomed several former USSR satellite nations into its membership. NATO forces, now we have UN-approved roles in Eastern Europe and even Afghanistan, and they have become the UN's military arm. Were he still alive, Dean Acheson would be thrilled with his creation's progress. For the 1991 war against Iraq, known as Desert Storm, President Bush the Elder, following precedent, sought and obtained authorization from the UN. He stated that a primary goal of the war was to bring about a reinvigorated United Nations, leading to a new world order. Years later, while preparing for the second war against Iraq, the younger Mr. Bush announced his desire to see the UN renew its purpose. The senior Bush said reinvigorate, and the son said renew, but each obviously wanted a stronger UN at the expense of U.S. independence. During his administration, President Clinton of the CFR turned to the UN subordinate NATO for authorization to send troops into the former Yugoslavia. And after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, President Bush the Younger sought and obtained the UN's authorization to conduct the war against terrorism. Despite public perception that our nation was acting independently in the Second Iraq War, the Bush administration repeatedly acknowledged the UN's role. In his formal March 20, 2003 letter to the UN Security Council, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations John Negroponte of the CFR stated that Security Council Resolutions 678 in 1990, 687 in 1991, and 1441 in 2002 had authorized the invasion. Thus, all of America's wars since World War II have been UN wars. Our leaders have also made America's armed forces repeatedly available for carrying out other UN missions. As have numerous predecessor administrations, Mr. Bush and his team of insider strategists, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, General Richard Myers, and everybody else, they've ignored their solemn oath to uphold the Constitution while committing America's military might to UN-authorized conflicts. The planned transfer of UN armed forces to a world's body, this control continues to unfold today. Powell provides more of the same. The number of CFR members in government service grew from 387 at the end of the senior Bush administration to 548 at the close of the Clinton years. At the halfway point in George W. Bush's first term, it stood at 516. Insider control of the U.S. government certainly isn't shrinking. Can CFR members be counted on to promote insider goals? While not every CFR member understands the real agenda of its inner circle, consider the performance of Colin Powell of the CFR. On January 17, 2001, while appearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in order to win confirmation as Secretary of State, he expressed total agreement with what he termed President-elect Bush's distinctly American internationalism. Speaking for both himself and Mr. Bush, he claimed, "We believe strongly in NATO," and he added, "I have seen what the UN can do over the years. It is a great organization, and it is deserving of our support." Secretary of State Powell's enthusiasm for the UN is as complete as his ardor for NATO, which is what should be expected from a man who spent part of his first day in office with CFR President Leslie Gelb and CFR veteran Frank Carlucci. During his first month as our nation's new foreign policy leader, Powell traveled to New York to meet with UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Emerging from the session with Annan, Powell told reporters, "When it comes to our role as a member of the Security Council, we obviously are bound by UN resolutions, and we're not trying to modify that. A Secretary of State who wasn't either an insider or a captive of the insiders would never place UN resolutions above the U.S. Constitution." In saner times, Powell would have been fired. Instead, he was showered with praise.